Hi, for a while now, I've been wanting to talk about some of the VR tools I'm using to build with. And the one I'm going to show you today is Gravity Sketch, which is something that works on both the Quest and on a tethered VR headset. Um, the Gravity Sketch does a lot of things, and I want to show you just basically some of the things it does. This is not meant to teach you how to use it, but just talk about the potential. If you hold down the purple key right here with the brush and the pencil, you get various options of shapes and ways in which you can construct. So if I pick the first one, that's called ink, I can draw a line that tapers. Or if I go to the next one down, stroke, it's basically the same kind of tool, but it doesn't have that taper. Underneath these, if I press again, there's a lot of ways in which I can adjust how these drawing tools work. Both of these are mostly used when it comes to sketching out a rough idea, and then you come in later with the skinning and the building of it. But this is very much like Tilt Brush. It's a way that you can create your initial sketches. These tend to be fairly high poly on their own, but just in this environment, they're just fine for mapping something out. Some other tools are, there's this one, which is Revolve, which I'm not going to do, but basically it's like making a vase. You're able to sort of extrude out organic shapes. This one is called Surface, and when I choose it, when I take the two controllers and hold them down, it allows me to basically create a ribbon that I can manipulate. There is one called Volume. Other apps call it a null object. I always think of it as being sort of a boulder maker. You can just draw in space and it'll actually make, sort of like a boulder, it'll make a mass object. This is really good when you're sort of putting together lumps of things or terrain. And then finally, down here, you have the primitive objects, which gives you some primitive shapes to start with. I work a lot with primitive objects, especially since many of the things I'm doing are architectural in nature. But right here, I've got the cube selected. So if I just click my trigger button, I generate a cube. So these are just the roughest sort of introduction to the kinds of shapes that you can make. Where the power really comes in is what you do with these shapes once you've made them. So as an example, this shape here, if you look on this handset, if I'm not touching it, the blue button is sort of a menu button for saving and for doing other functions. But when I pick up an object, it turns to this sort of look like lines with vertice points. And if I press it, it gives me more control over this shape, including the ability to edit it. Even though I've already made the strokes, I can fine-tune it and get it to be exactly what I want by grabbing these vertices. These lines tend to have lots of vertices and really smooth curves. And one of the things that I can do is that I can press this button, which is called Simplify Points. If I press it, each time I press it, it simplifies how many of these control points there are on an object. If I press it again, it's even less, so that I have fewer points in which to manipulate it. But it does allow me to make even smoother shapes. Another thing I can do is I can choose to trigger a low poly. So this creates something that's not as smooth, it's lower poly, and I can go back and forth between working with it like this and then turning low poly off and going back to working with it smooth. So if I pick any of these objects up, let's see, if I pick this object and I press the blue button, same thing. I've got control over each of the points within the curve. I can choose to make it low poly, so it's more sort of jagged, or I can also reduce and simplify the points so that I can get a similar shape without the complexity, and I have more control because I have smaller points to grab or fewer points to grab. Over here, same thing with this ribbon. If I press the blue button, I can make it low poly. So I'm working with something that probably is more suited to going into something like SketchUp or a video game. But I can also choose to simplify the points. So make it smoother while still retaining the ability to manipulate it. Can turn low poly on again to see what's happening underneath all that smoothing. And I also can turn on convert to a subdivision object. When I do that, it ends up being a very malleable, very smooth surface. And this is kind of how things like cars and surfaces and anything smooth that you want to have control over, you can do that through subdivision editing. And also I can make this low poly, even more low poly, and end up having control over a shape that is still small enough that could go into a program like SketchUp, but it gives me control over the curves in a way that you can't do if this was each one of these facets had the vertices you had to maneuver or move. Same here with this volume object. If I click the blue button, I have lots more control over how I want to continue editing that shape. Also really good for sort of rocks or tree masses. But I can choose the simplify points, and I can end up with something that's a little bit less complex and go low poly. Maybe I want to go bring back some of the complexity, but then go low poly. There we go. So there's something that is not crazy complicated, and I can bring it into something like SketchUp, or I can just turn it back to a smooth object. Like I said, where I do the most editing is when I am using some of the basic shapes. Often it's a cube or a plane. So if I hold onto it and press the blue button, it initially gives me the ability to rescale based on axes, a uniform scale for some reason. But I can also press the convert to subdivision object, and it gives me, like those objects, vertices that I can manipulate. So I can grab any of the corners. I can choose to grab the edges, the lines and edges, or I can grab of any face. So this is allowing me to grab a face. Let me make this a little bit smaller. If I grab it and then I hold triggers on both, I can shrink or grow a shape. So I'll make it a little bit smaller so I can work with it. Press that blue button again. I can grab a surface, and then using the joystick, I can go in or out to scale that surface. And if I press the trigger and move, I can extrude out that surface. And even though it's extruded and no longer just a cube, I can start to manipulate those surfaces. This is a really quick way to make very, very low poly objects. But let's say I don't want to make something super low poly, but I want it high poly because I'm going to 3D print it, but I want the simplicity of these kinds of controls. If I choose to turn on subdivision level, it starts to soften this shape. So underneath it is still that simple geometry, but I am able to manipulate it with the same edges, surfaces, and vertices, and I can up that subdivision level all the way up, so I end up with a very smooth, organic shape that I can manipulate. And although this is looking really smooth and is perfect for 3D printing, if I turn off subdivision, it still retains that simple shape underneath. And here's me turning it on again. Well, let's say that I really like this smooth shape, but I really can't deal with the amount of polygons that are actually hidden inside this to make it this smooth. I can turn on low poly, and you can see that it starts to get more faceted. And I can also turn down the subdivision level so that I still have something that's smooth, but I have less facets, less of complexity. So with the less facets, this is something that could come into SketchUp, still be smooth, especially with SketchUp smoothing tools, but it isn't going to be so huge that it crashes a program like that, or it could go into a video game that has low poly assets. And once again, if I turn off subdivisions, it's still this simple shape. So let's just ratchet it up all the way. Okay, and let's take that one and let me just duplicate it by pressing moving over and pressing a trigger. Now I have two of them. So this is the subdivisioned one, and this is a new copy of it. I can open it up and I can turn this off. So I'm back to that simple polygonal shape. And let's say that I just grab an edge and I start to just make an organic shape. And then I turn this back on. Now you can start to see where I could start to make organic creatures or objects and manipulate them in here. I can even, while in here, grab surfaces and extrude them in here as well. And this is really, really fast, very, very easy to manipulate. But if I want to turn off subdivisions, inside is still this simple shape. If I want to turn it on, have it be smoother, I can turn it on to low poly, and then I can turn down the subdivisions, so I end up with something that is a little bit friendlier for lower poly programs. So this is just a quick introduction to how these shapes can be used. In another video, I'll talk a little bit more about specific object creation and other aspects of working in VR. But at the very least, I wanted to introduce you to some of the options and how they could conceivably be used in one of your projects.